It's an Archaeodeath Interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome everybody to this 16th Archaeodeath Interview with myself, Professor Howard Williams, and my special guest this week, Dr. Emma Wells. And Emma is an expert in all things churchy, above and below ground and around. And I thought she's obviously a well-known medieval historian and archaeologist, and there's no more introduction required. I'm very delighted to have you on here, Emma, so that we can talk about a range of intersecting things that have an archaeodeath vibe to them, from pilgrimage, cathedrals, relics, and public archaeology stuff. So welcome.
Welcome. Well, thank you. And thank you for having me. That's an interesting welcome, and I think I do need it. Come on. But thank you nonetheless. Too kind.
Well, I'd never go down the traditional route of introductions. It's either 17 minutes or, oh, here's Emma, or something like that. So I thought I was my attempt at a balance. But yes, thank you for joining me. And this Archaeodeath interview series is really trying to go places nobody else goes. Not to go just down the traditional routes of a bit of tombs, a bit of skeletons, but to think about the ways in which mortuary archaeology interacts with many other kinds of subdiscipline of archaeology and other disciplines. So I thought, so many things we can chat about. But I want to start off by, could you introduce yourself to the millions of fans who'll be tuning in to this YouTube channel? Could you just give us an introduction to yourself in your own words rather than mine, of course, which is
Well, I don't know what I am really. I'm an ecclesiastical historian and buildings archaeologist, I suppose, and I specialize in the later medieval into Reformation period, but to be honest, Middle Ages, let's just say very broadly. So I go right back to the 8th century, right up to the 16th, so who knows. And I focus largely on, parish churches, but also cathedrals in the UK, let's just say broadly, Britain, I suppose. And I also specialise in the archaeology of the senses. So I'm particularly interested in understanding how, the experience of people in the past and how they interacted with and engaged in the buildings. And I suppose that leads into my public engagement work, which again, I want to, suppose, welcome the public to how people interpreted, experienced and understood the past and engaged with buildings there. So yeah.
So at one level, cathedrals and churches are so familiar and accessible. People feel they have an instinctive understanding of them, but actually the way we experience them may be very different from how people, say, in the 13th or 14th century or whenever, may have experienced them in the Middle Ages. Is that a fair assessment?
Definitely fair. Obviously, the Reformation era has a lot to answer for when it comes to the change, not just the Reformation, of course, but that was the sort of, I suppose, trigger point, catalyst to many other later Reformations and movements. But if we go back before that, before the 16th century, church worship in churches, devotion in churches was rather consistent in a way, but it's very different to what we experience today. I think we think of churches as either ruins in the ground or these big, vast, white, boring, stark buildings, and we forget that they weren't. Both interior and exterior were decorated in a whole variety of colors, reds, blues, golds as well. Images everywhere, the smells and bells of Catholicism. And so it's a far more interactive, sensory, stimulating environment than we can ever really appreciate, I think. Yeah.
And that was one of the things that started you off on this journey as a student, as a researcher, doing your PhD. But before, is that fair to say? That sensory aspect?
Yeah, I did an MA at York in buildings archaeology, but my dissertation focused on architectural space within stained glass windows. And that's how that started. And I wanted to look at, are they depicting buildings? How are they depicting buildings, I suppose? Are they depicting buildings in a contemporary manner, as in of that time, rather than, are they depicting buildings, medieval buildings of, biblical landscapes, etc. And they were. And, I looked at York Minster, the Great East Window and West Window. And then what I wanted to look at was, well, how did the audience receive these? If they're seeing buildings that they can recognize, what does that say? And so from there, it developed into an understanding of sensory experience, not just visual, which a lot of research has focused on in the past. There is sort of a sight bias, a visual bias throughout a lot of our research. So I wanted to look at everything, all the other senses, and how did pilgrims sensorially experience art and architecture in the medieval church and parish church. So that's what my PhD at Durham focused on. And I've continued from there and looked at the Reformation and thought, okay, then what happens when we take that all away?
Fantastic. And that sort of led you into building off that work, looking at pilgrimage routes more broadly. And you've got a whole book on that.
Pilgrim Routes of the British Isles is my first book, but that was more. So I had a colleague who was working at a different university, and he was looking at the experience of pilgrim routes, and I was looking at the interiors, and I thought, but actually, what's interesting is we call them routes, but a lot of our modern, pilgrim ways, pilgrim routes, they're not historic, they're not ancient, really, in their origin. A lot of them are. Some of them are. But it becomes more complex because if we think of St. Cuthbert's Way, for example, my favourite pilgrim route along the borders between England and Wales to Lindisfarne, to Holy Island. Well, if you're coming from the south, you're probably not going to travel that entire route. If you're coming from the west, you might, but it depends where you're coming from. It depends what your focus is. And a lot of our modern routes were actually created in the 80s and 90s, really, and they take in modern sites of tourism, which makes sense. I mean, pilgrim routes in the medieval era did too. They were, I suppose, aspects of tourism. But also, a lot of our pilgrims in the past actually would take the safest and quickest ways. So a lot of these were sort of ancient drovers' ways because, you're more concerned with, I don't know, being eaten alive by some sort of animal or some rabid human who's going to steal everything from you. So that's why the origins of pilgrim routes themselves is so fascinating, because it's just not easy to really understand.
So is it the case then that in the more populous areas of medieval Europe and Britain particularly, the pilgrims are just following everyone else's route, but that it's in the more Spartan and less populated areas that we can more easily identify routes that would have been especially pilgrimage routes? Or am I?
Yeah,
Is that the...
I think that's a fair assessment, really. I mean, we have like the Pilgrim's Way, which is very famous, and that we know from maps that was the way that one would travel. And there are specific pilgrim routes, but these were sort of created because you get from A to B, so you usually have one site and you end up on another site. So that's a little bit more of a ritualized pilgrimage, I suppose. But a lot of these, particularly in sparser places, particularly in the more rural places, you're absolutely right that people are coming the easiest way they can, traversing known routes, and therefore you end up with pilgrim routes later down the line, but they didn't necessarily begin that way.
So without being too unfair, there's a lot of folklore, a lot of later baggage, a lot of modern guff that's added to these routes for heritage tourism, deep time heritage tourism, I mean, in terms of, since the 18th century. Does that really, does that mean that everything you're doing in these research projects, from looking at churches and pilgrimage routes, you constantly sort of pivoting back and forth between trying to get at the kernels of what was actually going on in the Middle Ages and trying to challenge some of the preconceived ideas people have about that are really coming from very recent centuries, very recent times?
Yeah, that is the case. And particularly, I mean, a lot of our ideas, I suppose, of the Middle Ages derive from, I'd say, the Victorian sensibilities and utopian views of, with the birth of Neo-Gothicism and Romanticism came, the Middle Ages was seen as I say, an idyllic utopian world for various different reasons, but a lot of this centered around religion and the fact that Catholicism in the Middle Ages was seen as, the height of religion, and therefore we have the birth of, or the rise of Anglicanism and Anglo-Catholicism. Anglo-Catholicism from Anglicanism. And the High Church, etc., and the Cambridge Camden movement, the Oxford movement. So we had all these movements at one time, and we're still picking up the pieces and reinterpreting and trying to get at the medieval era itself and how it was truly lived. Because even to this day, you get a lot of misappropriation of even the word medieval, even the term, the concept. You know, it's barbaric, it's lawless, or it's beautiful and idyllic. Well, it's all of that and everything in between. And even the current headlines, you'll see, oh, the medieval, you know, the medieval way that this battle is going, the medieval way that this war is being fought. It's not medieval. It's just, it doesn't mean anything to me as a medieval.
Yeah. So we have this sort of, simultaneously we're valorizing and denigrating, you know, within the same, almost say, constantly playing this Janus-faced game with the Middle Ages, aren't we? Or with, you know, even the term itself, you know, has that mixture of, oh, holiness and sanctity and an idyllic world, and yet also something just really nasty and backward. And
I think that though is really interesting, because I think it proves how misunderstood the medieval era still is to this day.
Oh, yeah.
And I was recently on social media actually, and there was a post about churches in the Middle Ages, and it was everyone was illiterate and gargoyles were there to warn away all of this. It was just spewing, you know, falsities, and it angered me, because I thought, this is the problem. This is why people misappropriate what the Middle Ages were truly about.
This is it. I'm benign and placid as an individual and on social media, as you know, Emma. But mainly because I can take individual cliches on their own and I can cope with them. I go, that's fine. But when they're literally condensed into one, you know, magazine article or Twitter thread, and you know, it just, the rage builds, doesn't it? You go, what? No, gargoyles. What? You know,
Yeah.
And every myth packed into it, and it really does, it can be quite frustrating, can't it, to try and constantly myth busting these things.
It is myth busting, but I suppose that's how people learn, and I think myth busting is quite a good way
Yes.
of unraveling things, because it sort of takes things in bite-sized pieces, and rather it's very difficult to explain to someone who isn't a medievalist or has an understanding of history or archaeology, trying to explain why this is wrong and how it relates to the wider concept. And we often see that religion underpins that. And if you don't understand medieval religion, then you have to explain it all. So myth busting is perhaps the easiest way to do it. So we're just going to keep trying.
So, I mean, how much, I want to ask specifically about cathedrals next, but before we get onto that, I wanted to ask, how much do you think our vision of the Middle Ages is movie generated, or is it like Name of the Rose? It's everyone living in up to their legs in excrement, and then a few elite monks, everyone pushing the people down, literally throwing the scraps out of the monastery with,
Yeah.
is how I suppose my point is, how much are we, still, do movies drive this, or is that not a fair characterization? Is it other media that have given us those ideas?
I think it's right. I think our perspective of the Middle Ages has evolved, particularly because it's our first interaction with the medieval is often movies or video games. At school, primary school sort of level entry to the medieval, it's often very gendered and stereotypically gendered, of war, and this is the Wars of the Roses, or knights and princesses in their castle, these sorts of things. And now you have the whole Assassin's Creed generation and the Name of the Rose, as you said, and Pillars of the Earth and all of this. So I think putting all that together, we do think of the Middle Ages as this sort of fairy tale land filled with dragons too, with Game of Thrones. But even in general, and I think unfortunately for the teacher, even once you get to secondary school, and so on and so forth, for us, by the time we get to university level, we have to unpack all of that. We have to break it down and say, this foundation that you thought you had about the Middle Ages is fundamentally untrue, and this is why, and then build it back up. And that's quite a difficult task.
So how does your research and how does your your work challenging these preconceptions apply then to cathedrals? Because this is a particular theme of yours, isn't it? So I mean, it's always been there from, as you say, from your work on in York Minster, but how is it ongoing in dealing with the cathedrals?
Yeah, I suppose. So I started to look at this from. I'll use the term secular aspects of the cathedral, and there's a bit of an oxymoron here, but what I mean is the non-religious events, the non-religious activities which occurred in cathedral. Was sort of my sideline into this. And what I was particularly fascinated by was the modern movement, the modern turn towards holding non-religious activities and events within church buildings, whether they are cathedrals or churches, but largely we started with cathedrals. And we saw, for example, I believe it was at Norwich, the big Helter Skelter that was put in the nave. If you haven't seen it, Google it.
Oh yes, that caused all sorts, didn't it, of interest?
It did. And then there was a bit of a kerfuffle about the use, getting rid of pews and putting in chairs and all this sort of thing. And we've seen the introduction of post offices, libraries, wine tasting events.
Oh, I didn't know there were post offices in there. Wow.
Yeah, very common in more rural parish churches. But essentially, we're seeing churches and particularly cathedrals become multifunctional buildings or communal centres, communal hubs. And of course, it's I wrote a piece for the Church Times, and it was called "Heritage and Mission Are Not in Conflict." I think that was the title. But what I was trying to get at was, this is nothing new. We've been seeing this since the medieval era. Secular, refer to it as that, events were occurring particularly in the naves of cathedrals right back. The naves of cathedrals where the laity would congregate. You would look for work. You might look for a date. You might sit and have a drink of mead. There might be cockfights, we see as well. But there's also the thing called church ales, which were very common in parish churches and led to the later church halls, which is essentially a fundraising event where everyone gets drunk, but the church makes the ale, so it's passive. But that's where a lot of things come from. That's where a lot of our, as I say, church halls, community halls stem from. So all of this, the church as the sacred, holy, guarded space, this liminal space, once you enter, everything is sacred. That's not true, really. I think there's a hierarchy, of sacredness, if we want to do that. But you used to get football matches in churchyards, and particularly you have the Shrovetide, Pancake Day, essentially, football matches. So why should it be any different now? Use these churches.
So in that sense, it's not so much my first question, or near second question, I can't remember which, was actually saying, well, are we challenging the difference of past and present? Actually, in this case, you're actually saying they're more similar than this Victorian edifice that we've created in between, that we're trying to push past to get at the connections between the social secular uses of these. That's really interesting. And so you're working on, the cathedrals is an ongoing project looking at cathedrals in comparative terms and their stories over the long term, which links past to present.
Yeah, and so my book, which is out in July, Heaven on Earth, this looks at about 16 different cathedrals, and it's all over, particularly all over, we'll call it Christendom, and just how even the local community was involved in building these houses of God. We tend to think, again, that these are such revered buildings, but actually the local community was involved. They fundraised, they helped build them in some respects, at least we think so. And they're also, what's so important about cathedrals is they're essentially stone and mortar edifices which encapsulate our history. That's what they are. They're history in stone. They relate to, not only because of the people, but also the construction. They relate to every single aspect, from politics they show, religion obviously they show, changes in faith, belief systems, changes in economy, changes in art, architecture and fashion. You can see all this in this one building within each community.
So the cliche, but written in stone, you have the biography of the city, but also the region and the broader international networks that those cities and regions are part of. It's all encapsulated in these buildings. So 16. So I mean, you're going quite geographically wide with this.
Yeah, I mean, largely Christendom. So Istanbul to Venice to, gosh, let me remember them all. To Spain, to Spain, to France, to England. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Italy, we've done that. But the main cathedrals, I mean, a lot of them, it centres around the birth of Gothic, essentially, because when we think of cathedral, let's be honest, we think of a Gothic cathedral usually, whether it's early Gothic or neo-Gothic.
Yeah.
But that really is when in my opinion, the true image of the cathedral was born. So yeah.
Thank you. So in many ways, all of your research that we've talked about so far, the dead have been hovering in the wings, but not far away in different regards. I mean, is there any way any of these things encapsulated directly in your research, looking at mortuary practice or the veneration of saints? Obviously, is a part of, how do the dead fit into your work so far?
Oddly enough, I would say that cathedrals are as much for the living as they are the dead. And they exist as much for the dead as for the living. We wouldn't have cathedrals if it weren't for saints,
Yeah.
if it weren't for their relics, if it weren't for the essentially bits and pieces and bodies of saints. And the majority were built around a particular saint and shrine, and therefore attracted pilgrims. And the more pilgrims came, the more money they would generate through their offerings. Because they were getting something out of it, hopefully a miracle or a cure. So in all of our cathedrals, there were dead pieces or dead bodies throughout, and they are being revered, whether they are, as I say, whether they are saintly and they're producing miracles, or whether they are just a renowned individual. A great example of this would be Winchester, where you have a saint, you have Saint Swithin, but then you also have the early medieval Anglo-Saxon bishops who are as revered as Saint Swithin, and all their bits and pieces are put in. And then you have extremely grand 15th century chantry chapels. So just before chantries were obviously eradicated by Henry in the 16th century, but these beautiful chapels which were an absolute fortune, but they are built to commemorate the dead, that person, and have masses said for that person for hundreds of years, or so they thought, after their soul went up. Hopefully their soul could get through purgatory. So they are living embodiments of what happens post-obit, really.
So it's not just the relics of saints themselves, it's the tombs of those who want to be associated with the relics of saints, and the whole building builds off this, from chantry chapels to, every piece of material investment.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that the cathedrals were built as much for the pilgrims as they were for just the devotion to that saint. If you look at some of our great cathedrals, they are what I would call the medieval equivalent to a modern theme park. They are, and the more attractions you have, the better rides you have, the more people are going to come. And it's true, because as they acquired more and more relics, as they acquired better relics, better renowned individuals, more renowned individuals, the more pilgrims would come to them. And, the more chances a pilgrim would have to gain whatever he needed to. And as time goes on, as the medieval era draws on, you see the art and architecture reflecting this. You see a growing desire, I suppose, to... Now, I won't get into the whole discussion about the access to all of these shrines, because it is sort of case-by-case basis in some respects. But there seems to be a growing desire to allow pilgrims closer to the relics, to allow them a better experience, an augmented experience, a heightened sensory experience. When we think about shrine structures, we start with the sort of foramina, the sort of porthole-esque openings, think Whitchurch, etc., that sort of thing. And then as time goes on, they develop into fully formed niches, prayer niches for pilgrims.
Right.
St. William of York's tomb, bits of it still remain in, I believe it's now in the crypt and a bit in Yorkshire Museum as well, if you want to go see it. These are beautiful perpendicular, ogee arches, Gothic crotcheted pinnacles, and all these sorts of elegant architecture. But that's there for a specific reason, so that pilgrims can interact, pray, and towards these saints, whereas before it was just sort of a hole and pilgrims got stuck sometimes. But all of this is sort of interacting, and they're creating specific routes through the wall paintings, through stained glass, through gates. Essentially, the cathedral was a super shrine and a super structure to that shrine that was within. You see this in parish churches too.
I hadn't thought of it like that. That's fantastic. Yeah, and so relics are a thing that you're going to be doing ongoing work on.
Yeah, my next book is going to be on relics and the culture of relics, and the idea of what happens when you don't have enough to go around, I suppose. in the 8th century and then into the 9th, it was sort of a requisite to have a relic in your altar. That is what sanctified your church. And therefore you needed bits and pieces of saints in your church, to sanctify your church. And therefore a whole enterprise sprung up as a result. An enterprise which sourced relics for churches and monasteries. So yeah, that's what the book's about.
Fantastic. So your work so far, therefore, if I can encapsulate it and do correct me, is telling the story of the Middle Ages through the sensorial interactions with sacred spaces or churches more broadly, the landscape through pilgrimage, cathedrals as stories of the communities and the cities in which they are in, and relics as a way of telling the story of the relationship of the very special dead, if that's the right phrase, with communities, which is fantastic. And you've all the time we're back and forth from challenging preconceptions in the present and delving into the medieval past. But I wanted to sort of wrap up, or not wrap up, but take it further by talking about how you work as a communicator, because perhaps more than anyone I know, you have put so much effort into both your public facing education and engagement more broadly. And I wonder if you could share with us some lessons or reflections on how that's worked for you. Why did you start doing that, and how did it develop, and how is it going? Because there's so many people who try it, including me, but you've really succeeded at this.
I'm not sure about that, but thanks. I think it was sort of happenstance. I think what interests me isn't looking at, I don't know, a tiny piece of architecture and talking about that in a very, very specific, using extensive terminology, because although that's wonderful and we need those people, but you can't extend that, you can't communicate to a broad audience. And that was what interested me, because yes, what I do what I want to do is understand the past through the built environment. That's what it's about, through the ecclesiastical built environment. And I want to open up the public's minds to the fact that church buildings are rife with misunderstanding, but also misappropriation. But also they're so fascinating, they're so interesting. And did you know this about this? And did you know there are lewd and crude images and naughty images and all this?
Yes. I know you've been talking about this stuff.
Yeah, but that's how you capture the public's imagination. And so I just think I happen to fall into those particular subjects. That's what interested me. And that's how I fell into it. And so I suppose, as we've spoken about before, it's become its own niche, which is public church archaeology, or church public archaeology, whichever you want to call it. But that's public archaeology now it's at the heart of study in higher education in the 21st century, because we understand as academics we need to diversify the way that we communicate to students, and we shouldn't be in our ivory towers and gatekeeping our research, because what's the point, really? But I think public archaeology and public engagement has been developing. It's even evolving as a way that we research and we understand sites, because we're being far more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary in our research. It's allowed us to do that. But also it opens up students' minds that how are we communicating our research? What are we actually trying to find out? Is this important? And therefore that's why I focus the way I do. And as yet, really, there hasn't been a sort of critical evaluation of public church archaeology and bring in, material culture and the built environment of religious places together.
This is an interesting thing, because for me, I feel that, there is a stereotype. I must admit, there's a bias I have, that I think, well, churches are surely going to be the least popular aspect of the early medieval past. People like, Stonehenge and big megalithic tombs, and it's very difficult to. And for my period, there's things that I know capture the imagination, but. Actually, churches are really popular, aren't they? They're incredibly popular, both for individual communities, but on a national scale. And I think a lot of archaeologists have, including me, I confess, have perhaps neglected this. And so you say there's a public archaeology of churches, or church public archaeology, but has everyone really? would you find that in many textbooks about public engagement and heritage management? And have we as a discipline kind of overlooked one of our most popular assets in ecclesiastical landscapes and architectures?
I think so. I mean, if you are a medievalist, say, or a medieval historian, then you know full well that the church is at the heart of medieval life.
Yeah.
You know, it punctuates. It's all the rites of passages. You know, birth, marriage, and death. That it is the church. I mean, I'm not saying by any means that people were going to church every single day. They weren't. They were going on Sundays and the high feast days. But as we've seen, there were more non-religious activities circulating around the church building. It was the heart of the community. So we can't overlook that, because virtually every aspect of medieval society has been dictated, formed, developed, changed, and augmented by the church, by the religious landscape of the Middle Ages. So it's just, I think it's impossible for us to overlook. Has it been overlooked? Particularly in archaeology, I would argue yes, because we tend to find there is church archaeology, and we can think of, I'm just looking at my bookshelf over here, The Archaeology of Churches by Warwick Rodwell and Roberta Gilchrist's work. But that's very archaeologically based, you know, really. I mean, it's wonderful when it first came out, but we can develop on that, because as we, you know, as we do research and as we do analyze and evaluate and interpret, and we find more data, I believe now we're becoming a little bit more, as I say, interdisciplinary, and I think that's important. And I think archaeologists understand just how important history is, and art history, and you know, all the other disciplines. And sometimes it's not always reciprocated, but that's allowing us to think, hang on, have we overlooked this? We're not just looking at the ruins of monasteries or whatever it might be below ground. What about the standing buildings? What about those which remained? It shouldn't be one or the other. It should be just public church archaeology. And I know, for example, even in the modern day, there are some institutions that maybe conserve churches or look after churches and don't understand how a church works. If you don't understand how a church works, how do you put it to the public today? You're missing all the really interesting, juicy bits. And it's the same with how we interpret them in the past.
I mean, without naming names of bad, what do you think, frankly, are our biggest collective failings in doing public engagement with churches? And what do you think are our greatest successes so far, or we could build on?
I think our failing is education. I really do. I think for many reasons, but it stems from, I would say, right back to key stage level, right back to primary school level, really. Unless you go to perhaps the Church of England school over here, or a Catholic primary school, something like that, religion isn't really, and I obviously I don't know what it's like now, but I did go to a Church of England primary school, and religion was at the heart of what we did. It was just another lesson, another aspect. It wasn't even really thought about as religion. You know, we had Friday assembly, and we'd go to church for Christmas and Christingle services and all the like. So it, again, punctuated all aspects of the year. But it's not really, I don't even remember, and I don't know whether you do, remember actually studying religion throughout school level. You don't.
That's, certainly not its material elements, you know.
You don't understand what a church is.
No.
And I think there's a real gap in the market for presenting that to the public, particularly children. You know, what is a church? Why do we have a nave? Why do we have a chancel? Why do we act like this? Why do we do this? And it's not specifically about religion, just about an understanding. And therefore, when you get to an undergraduate and even postgraduate level, a lot of my students, in fact, don't just know the basics of a church building. And why would you, if you've not been to one, if you don't understand that? So education. And there are so many people who are just perhaps interested in the art or the architecture and will, you know, dip into online lectures. But if you don't know those fundamentals, you're not really fully getting an understanding of it. You can appreciate it, but why can we not convey that to the general public so that they can actually understand why these buildings are so important and we should still conserve them?
I mean, this is very much interests me from a funerary archaeology perspective, because if you don't understand those broader spaces, how on earth, you know, you can perhaps go on Twitter or you can go on various sites and see pictures of tombs, effigy tombs or brasses, but unless you you're treating them just like collections of clocks or old books if you don't understand the physical spatial context in which those monuments and memorials operate. Is that so I do wonder whether a lot of our public engagement going, I'm not naming names again, but here's a tomb. This is the tomb of Sir Richard Blothley of in the parish church of whatever. And we go, oh, look, he had a moustache. And it's not really getting us very far in terms of understanding how that monument worked and operated in a space. And the same goes for cathedrals too. And I don't know if that's something that resonates with you. And it probably applies to other aspects of furnishings and fittings and installations.
I think this is the problem. And again, I think the tide is changing. I do. And I think the heritage interpretation is changing, particularly in ecclesiastical sites. I do. However, you're right. Churches are not just, they are curated collections, I suppose, over centuries and millennia, but they are not just a curated collection of art and monuments and architectural elements. They're not. The reason that we have certain tombs and why something might be in that location and why it's in that particular transept or whatever, there is a history, there is a context, and there is a significance to that. And that's why when we as heritage professionals, we look at any sort of development work, we understand the significance of whether it's just a monument, whether it's a particular area of a church, whether it's, I don't know, a window, whatever it might be. You have to understand that significance, and to understand the significance, you have to know why it's there, who built it, and what was that person doing, how was it used. If you don't know that, as I say, it just becomes an assemblage of objects that are separate. They're in a vacuum, I suppose. They don't mean anything. They don't interrelate. They don't. And as you say, going up to interpretation boards and just looking at, this is the tomb of so and so. Well, who's so and so? What's the context? And I've just started doing. I created a Substack. And within it, I'm doing sort of weekly church crawls, sort of weekly audio podcasts. And I walked into this church the other day, and it's an extremely important church in the middle of nowhere, really, in North Yorkshire. And there's a tomb to, let's just say, I won't give the game away, but it's a child and his relationship to the Wars of the Roses. He's an extremely important, this tomb is probably, I think, the only royal within a parish church, essentially, tomb. But it's just a church in the middle of nowhere. And you think, well, it's great, and they have got this interpretation board, but you need to put it into context. And there's this huge castle next to the church, ruined. But if you don't put it into context, people know what the Wars of the Roses are. People know what this king is. But what about the rest of it? And so that's why. And so at the moment, this tomb is sort of shoved in one of the corners. Well, he shouldn't really be there. He's not in the right place. And that's what happens. The context is lost. The significance of why that monument there is lost, because we essentially just, it becomes doing what we can rather than really understanding why everything is there.
So I don't know if you did answer the second half of my earlier question. Maybe you have, but about, what do we do badly we need to do more of? But what have we done? I suppose what I was trying to get at is what have we done effectively as well? Because it's not all doom and gloom. What have you feel you've been doing that's worked particularly well? You mentioned your new Substack. I didn't. This is brand new. But are things that are more established that you feel have worked?
But that's the thing. I think the tide is changing. I started saying that, and I think that is true. We do see far more better interpretation.
Okay.
Within ecclesiastical sites. For example, I'm thinking York Minster, the crypt. I think it's called York Minster Revealed, still in the crypt. And you can go down, you can see the earlier origins of the minster physically in front of you. You can look at the tomb of St. William of York and then unravel from there. Winchester Cathedral's got it absolutely fantastic. In the south transept, fantastic interpretation, 2-3 stories, and it shows you from the archaeologists excavating some bits and pieces and that story, and therefore what they've excavated and how that fits into the whole story. And it is so interdisciplinary. You can see the art there, you can see the archaeology, you can see the history, and it's all put together to unravel the history of why Winchester Cathedral stands, because originally there were 2 minsters, and then we ended up with the one we've got, and how this relates to what was going on and how important you know, this was I suppose really the capital of England, can we call Winchester, and you know, and House of Wessex and all that goes together. And so interpretation is getting better. Feeding information to the public is getting better. But there's still more to do, and I think the gap can be plugged through education. Offering courses and those sorts of things on this is only just the
For all ages, in other words, not.
Yes.
So I thought earlier when you were saying education, then you focus very much about school, the experience at school, but you know, it is about adult education, isn't it?
I
It's
think
what
for
you're.
everyone. Yep,
Yeah,
absolutely
yeah.
for everyone. You know, courses that are just open to the public. You know, you're interested in this bit. Well, actually, do you know the reason why you're interested in this? Do you know all the bits that are interesting? And this is why it's so important. If you can put that out there, then I think it goes a good way to preserving these monuments for the future, extending their longevity, but also thinking about what we're going to do with them and why, and because that's important.
I mean, this is one of the things that I've been particularly concerned and talking to you about how much do we dumb down, how much do we use, you know, hooks, you know, ways to, you know, entry points. And one particular example that comes to mind is the challenge of the problems and potentials of using terms like treasure or treasures, national treasures, cultural treasures, to regard these buildings and aspects of their interiors as valued, unique, even things we should cherish, things we should value beyond their religious functions in devotional practice, to think about them as spaces of learning space. And yet also the very baggage of that term treasure does have that associations with monetary value, with things that sparkle. And many of the treasures that you would think are most treasured in the cathedral may be very humble objects, may empty the empty space, the air between the columns, or the, you know, so it's a blessing and a curse, this kind of term, I guess.
It is. I mean, obviously the term treasure in an ecclesiastical setting has a legal definition, so I can understand where it's come from, in a sense, but it has been used. It has sort of a PR spin on it, really, that come look at our great treasures, and we think of treasure. I suppose again it goes back to being younger and pirates and treasure and look, pieces of gold and jewels and all this thing. It's let's draw people in using the shiny sparkly gem, you know, rather than anything else. And I understand that, because these are still, I suppose they're still businesses in a sense, a lot of our heritage sites. We just have to think of the treasures of St. Cuthbert at Durham Cathedral. And these are treasures. I mean, technically they are treasures. I mean, I'm sure they're worth quite a lot of money, some of these things. But, you know, I lead tours at Durham Cathedral. And for me, the treasures of that experience are not going to the museum, which is fantastic. Don't get me wrong, the Archaeological Museum and Heritage Centre is fantastic. But we're walking into the nave. You have this piece of Purbeck marble on the floor, and people are just walking over it every day. Well, we think that women couldn't pass that piece of marble. We don't. There's a whole misogynistic culture and cult centered around the cult of St. Cuthbert. And so this all goes back to pilgrimage and St. Cuthbert, and that's what Durham are putting forth. And it's like, you've made nothing about this. Okay, it's just a line of Purbeck marble, but it's so important. And you could be telling the story of this. So to me, that's the treasure.
That's a really great example. And I think, you know, another one, thinking of Durham, is that it isn't hardly neglected, but it's the great knocker on the door. Is for some people such an icon, more than if you said, well, what is, you know, maybe the pectoral cross, maybe they'll know that St. Cuthbert is associated with that cross, but perhaps Durham Cathedral is, the things that people find to it are not often the things that people want, the authorities themselves would consider. Very interesting.
I did a lecture series for Ripon Cathedral last October, I believe, and I really got, because Ripon was sort of the home of sanctuary, really, and looking at St. Wilfrid Sanctuary, and they had sanctuary stones around Ripon, and this sort of liberty area of liberty, if you will, St. Wilfrid.
Yes.
But I sort of really got into the research on sanctuary, and I was like, and I realised that you didn't just go and knock on a knocker, and it was far more complicated and jurisdictional, in fact, that there's such great stories that could be told. And I was you know, I was unraveling all these great stories about Durham, about Ripon, and all these, and I just thought you could do a wonderful exhibition on this and really bring to the fore the sanctuary knocker. Maybe I'm giving Durham Cathedral ideas here, but everyone knows that sanctuary knocker. Yes, it's a replica that's on there now, but I just thought, tell people the stories. People want to know about people. That's why people are interested in history, or the general public, even us, I would argue.
Well, thank you so much, Emma, because I think your books are, you won't say it, but your books are another way in which we engage, and both your forthcoming and imminently forthcoming and future works, I think, are going to be. Let's not downplay that the written word is such an important medium for communicating, but also your tours and your digital engagement, I think, are going to be such an important resource for moving forward, not only on this particular topics we've discussed, but I think knowing all the other things you're ongoing dealing with in terms of church archaeology and architecture and buildings, structures, and the stories behind them, I think this is going to be I'm looking forward to seeing what you get up to in future years. But have you any sort of final thoughts for us Archaeodeath obsessives about that you have?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult question, but I think it's, you know, I always say at the end of my, this is a bit of self-promo again, but at the end of my Substack post, I always say, don't forget, always keep looking up. And I don't mean that in the sense of let's always be positive, but yeah, seriously, let's always look up and always look down. What I mean by that is, let's look at the really fascinating, the insightful things. Why are we drawn to these buildings? And what are we trying to actually communicate and say about them? As in, what I mean by that is, why is our research important? Let's not just do research for research's sake. I mean, of course, research is important regardless, but why are we so fascinated with church archaeology? And why is it important not only back for then, but for the now and for the future?
Thank you so much, Emma. And I will put in the description below all of the links to your wonderful digital presences on all platforms, every platform. And but thank you, Archaeodeathlings, and we'll be back for hopefully more interviews in the near future. But thank you for now, Emma.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much for having me.
For relaxing times, make it Archaeodeath time.